Good morning. My name is Eric McGhee, and I am a senior fellow with the Public Policy Institute of California. I want to thank you for tuning into our program today, where we're going to feature the findings of a new PPIC report, Equity and Voter Turnout After Pandemic Election Changes. That's co-authored with my colleague, Jennifer Pollack at PPIC, and with Mindy Romero of the Center for Inclusive Democracy at USC. The report, the technical appendices for the report, and the slides from today's presentation are all going to be available on our website at ppic.org. I would like to thank the PPIC Corporate Donor Circle, the Corporate Circle and the PPIC Donor Circle for supporting this virtual event. As a reminder, PPIC is a public charity and does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. For today's program, I will first present some key findings from the report. Then I'll invite a panel of experts to join me for a conversation. That panel of experts may include my cat, which may have passed through just as a warning. Finally, at the end of the program, we'll set aside some time to answer audience Q&A. Our panel today is a really great group of people, including co-author Mindy Romero, Dean Logan, the registrar of LA County, and Astrid Ochoa, who formerly the director of the Future of California Elections. So I'll get to them in a second, but it's just stay tuned because it's going to be a great conversation afterward. Finally, at the end of the program, we set aside some time to answer audience Q&A. If you have a question for our panelists, please send an email to the address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. We'd appreciate you including your name and organization along with your question. And I'll try to remind you of that email address as we make our way through the program. With that, I'll get my slides started and begin the presentation. So this report looks at some of the changes that that California made to elections in 2020 to cope with the pandemic that was well underway by that point in time. The state took two broad approaches to dealing with the pandemic. It went for a lot more mail voting by mailing every voter a ballot, and it consolidated in-person voting locations to make it easier to staff and to, again, reduce the risk of in-person exposure. So what we want to look at in this report is whether these changes affected the representativeness of the electorate, voting equity. So a key goal of many reforms to elections, especially in California, is to try and end the so-called exclusive electorate by closing what is sometimes called the turnout gap, the gap between participation by underrepresented groups and participation by overrepresented groups. So we did a report last year, my co-authors and I, that showed that the universal vote by mail piece, sending everybody a ballot, does raise total turnout, and that the consolidation of the in-person options has a more mixed effect on that total turnout. But an effect on total turnout might mask differences for different groups. And so we want to know whether it's improving or exacerbating that pre-existing turnout gap for voters of color and for young people. Oops. And we look at this in three different contexts. So we first look at the 2020 general election and look at universal vote by mail. And so this involves putting California into the broader context of the rest of the country, because California, every place in California was universal vote by mail in 2020. So we put that California into that broader context to look at the effect in the 2020 general election. And we also look specifically at the LA primary election in March of 2020 and leverage a sort of a natural experiment that occurred there in terms of mailing everybody a ballot, but it's still looking at universal vote by mail, but in this time in the context of a primary election. And then finally, we look we go back to the general election and look at the effect of these in-person consolidations within California, because some counties, different counties took different approaches to this in-person consolidation. Whoops. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to start by looking at what other states did and what California did, sort of this policy background. Then I'm going to get into these universal vote by mail results, the effect of those on equity, and then the results for the in-person voting options, and then finish with some conclusions and recommendations. And what I'm going to be showing you here all the way along is how these changes affected the gaps, these turnout gaps between different groups. And so it's always a relative comparison between one group and another. So the policy landscape. In 2020, there was an enormous amount of experimentation with different approaches to voting by mail to try and encourage more of those mailed ballots. So 9 states removed restrictions on signing up. 15 states mailed every voter and who wasn't already signed up to vote by mail an application to encourage them to vote by mail. And then 7 states in the District of Columbia mailed every voter an actual ballot, regardless of whether they signed up for it or not. And California was one of these states. So this map just shows you that just an incredible diversity of changes all across the country that occurred with this level of experimentation and change in election administration is really unprecedented. So this was an extraordinary time. And it was it touched all parts of the country. So California has since decided to continue mailing every voter a ballot into perpetuity. But then beyond that, it also made some other changes, as I suggested. So it allowed counties to take one of 5 approaches to their in-person voting. So 16 counties continued with just a traditional polling place system, where the number of polling places they provided was dictated by existing law. And everybody had to vote at their own local neighborhood polling place. Then 7 counties consolidated their polling places, but still made them accessible only to people in a particular neighborhood. Then 17 counties consolidated polling places, but made them accessible to anyone in the county. So kind of broadened it out. You could go to the one nearest your house, you could go the one nearest your work, whatever. Then there were 15 counties that had already kind of started something like that consolidation with countywide access through something called the Voters' Choice Act. And again, there was some differences between the Voters' Choice Act and what the 17 counties that consolidated with countywide access did. But in broad strokes, they were very similar. And then finally, there were 3 very small rural counties that had already switched to an all vote by mail system, where they didn't have any polling places. You could vote at the county registrar's office, but otherwise it was all vote by mail. And this, again, a map showing you just how kind of diverse these changes were geographically across the state. So lots of different counties and lots of different parts of the state taking lots of different approaches. So what do we see in terms of the effect of this universal vote by mail approach on equity? This graph shows the effect on the turnout gaps for each of these groups. So a positive number here is where the gap shrank. It's making the representativeness of the electorate better. Negative numbers are where it's expanding that gap and making the representativeness worse. We're showing here the other 6 universal VBM states plus DC, and then pulling out California specifically. So California, in most of these cases, compares pretty well with the other universal VBM states, and in fact does better for African Americans, where there really was no effect for in other universal VBM states for turnout. But overall, the results here suggest that universal vote by mail does in fact improve equity for the groups that we're looking at here. So it shrinks that turnout gap. And this is again in the 2020 general election. Paradoxically, we see the opposite effect in the 2020 primary. So with the exception of Asian Americans, the gaps actually grew for the parts of LA County that received universal mail ballots. Now we did some extra analysis, and we don't think this has anything to do particularly with LA County. This is really a primary thing. And that's because the turnout actually increased for each of these groups. So mailing everybody a ballot actually elevated everybody's turnout, but it elevated it more for seniors and non-Hispanic whites. And that actually expanded that turnout gap. And the challenge here is that in a primary election, the baseline turnout rate is very low. And so the people who are sort of on the cusp of participating tend to come from those overrepresented groups. So if you nudge everybody sort of equally toward participation, you're likely to nudge more overrepresented group members over the line. So finally, looking at the impact of consolidating in-person options on equity. Here the results are more mixed. African Americans and Latinos, we see signs of an expanding turnout gap across the board for the consolidations. Asian Americans and youth, it's a little bit more mixed. And this is here showing people who had previously registered as permanent vote by mail. So in that sense, they were kind of, you might imagine they were expecting, or they were comfortable with the idea of voting by mail and maybe expecting to mail their ballots in. Oops. And then here's the same for people who did not register as permanent vote by mail, and so maybe were more inclined to vote in person. And here the effects are more consistently negative, again, with the exception of youth. So we do see some negative results here with this consolidation. So what do we take from all this? Well, first, universal vote by mail does seem to produce a modest improvement in equity for fall elections, but things are a little more complicated with primaries because of this kind of the low baseline turnout issue. For the consolidating the in-person options, there definitely was a more mixed bag here with some worsened equity in many cases. This includes for the Voters' Choice Act consolidations, which had kind of been planned beforehand. So there's definitely something about this consolidation that we should sort of pay closer attention to. I think it's worth noting here that first of all, the in-person consolidation findings, they're always measured against the overall change in California in 2020, which, as we showed, is positive. So overall, California actually saw a more representative electorate in 2020 than in 2016, but it wasn't as good in the counties that did the consolidation. So it's important just to keep that in mind. This is a relative thing. But from this, we kind of conclude that we really should be doing more, first of all, more outreach to underrepresented groups in primaries. There needs to be more targeting if we expect to see equity improvements in a primary context where there are these specific challenges. And then more outreach also to underrepresented groups about the in-person voting process. So whatever that ends up being, it's important to do a lot of outreach and targeted outreach to underrepresented groups to make sure that they're fully informed about the changes that are going to be happening. And I think these findings also suggest that we need to possibly rethink some of this in-person consolidation, or at least how we do it, and maybe how much we do it, because of the impacts on equity. I think it's also important to remember, just as a final note, that this is not, it may be tempting with the universal VBM finding to conclude that the best approach is to just get rid of in-person voting options entirely, but quite to the contrary, our findings suggest it's important to continue to have some of those in-person options, and that a lot of voters who receive ballots in the mail are going to want to return them in person. And so that the quality and the availability of those in-person options continues to matter. So again, as I said at the outset, If you have questions that you'd like to ask our fantastic panel, please submit them to me. Please submit them to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. All right. So I'd now like to welcome our panelists. Their bios can be found on the PPIC event page. So in the interest of time, I'll only do just brief introductions here today. I'd first like to welcome Dean Logan, who is the Registrar Recorder and County Clerk for the County of Los Angeles. Thank you, Dean, for being here with us today. Next, I'd like to invite Astrid Ochoa, who is the owner and principal of Ochoa Consulting Partners and the former executive director of the Future of California Elections. Thank you, Astrid, for joining us. And last but not least, Mindy Romero, who's the director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy at the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy, and also a co-author on this report. Thanks for joining us, Mindy. So the first question I'd like to throw out to the panelists, I think, is to take a step back from the findings of this report and so forth, and just kind of talk a little bit about the experience of going through planning for an election, an extraordinary election like this. So the process of planning for something that nobody had ever experienced before was probably intense and traumatic, to say the least. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like to be working through those decisions? What are the constraints you faced? What are some of the issues that you had to balance? And maybe let's start with you, Astrid.
Good morning, everyone. First, thank you to PPIC for the invitation to join this conversation. It's great to see Dean and Mindy and Eric. We don't get to see each other in person very much nowadays, so it's always nice to have this opportunity. And so the part that I heard about your question was trauma, and we were joking about this earlier. And I think it's just important to remember that it was unprecedented, that we are still in it, right? And so planning the election back in 2020, some of the challenges that we were facing was a time constraint, planning for an election that was just a couple of months in front of us. And then also the fact that the pandemic was ever evolving. If you remember, in those early months, we were all at home Googling how to make homemade masks out of t-shirts. We didn't know infection rates. We didn't know, we were bringing home groceries and wiping them down and sanitizing, right? So we were in a very different period where there was just so many unknown factors. And here, election officials were charged with hosting an election and keeping our democracy going. And so there was a lot of things to balance. But first and foremost was, how do we plan an election that is going to be safe for both voters and for election staff? And how do we make sure that we minimize any negative impact to vulnerable populations? And now, not just traditionally underrepresented voters, but those voters that were immune compromised as well. And so all of these were things that we were grappling with as a community in the elections world and also in the advocacy space. And I have to commend our former Secretary of State, Secretary Padilla, who put together a task force that was truly cross-sector, bringing together election officials, advocates, community groups, labor, business. It was led by his chief of staff with James Schwab, with hours and hours and hours of committees to think through every single aspect of the election process. And on top of that, there were networks like Future of California Elections, like CACO, who were also coming together with their members to think through elections. So there was just a really overwhelming commitment to making sure that California's voters could vote. On top of that, right, we were all dealing with our personal struggles. And so the balance was that every individual had their own circumstances. Mine were, taking care of a just turned 3-year-old with no childcare and running a nonprofit and trying to make sure that my passion, which is committing access to voters, was still represented. And so this is what 2020 was like, and the question just always brings me back to those moments, how people had an unprecedented challenge, election officials, community organizers, and everyone stepped up to it. And so it was exciting to see the report findings. And I think that the policies that were put in place were about having an election in a pandemic. And I have to congratulate everyone who was part of that, because I think we did it.
Dean, let me throw the question to you next.
Great. Well, good morning or good afternoon to everybody, and thank you, PPIC and Eric, for inviting us and for sharing the data. Astrid and Mindy, always good to be on a panel with the two of you and to share reflections. I think the importance of the work that you've done and analyzing the 2020 election is just really important going forward. And I know we'll have an opportunity to talk about that a little bit later. I think when I think about the 2020 election cycle, and Eric, you said this in your question when you said what was it like to prepare to do something that we had never done before. I think the irony for Los Angeles County is we were already preparing to do something that we had never done before. So we were implementing a new voting model that we had worked on for over a decade, and then we layered on top of that the impact of the pandemic, as well as just to recall for all of us that we were also in the heart of civil unrest. This was at the time of the right after the killing of George Floyd and the impact on that in our communities as well. So it really was a compounding of a lot of different dynamics. And so I think the word that comes to mind for me is just the uncertainty of it, of not knowing from day to day what was going to come next, but recognizing that we still had to prepare for really the largest election cycle in our history. So for us in LA County, it was juggling critical priorities. So we were at the beginning of this. We were in the middle, or not even in the middle. We were in the start of the post-election canvass of the March primary when the significance of the pandemic really hit, and we were notified that we needed to close down our operations and start to look at a telework environment while we're still canvassing the primary election, which had issues. I mean, we undertook a huge change in that March primary, and there were concerns and issues coming out of that we needed to address. But as I said, you're also juggling that with closing down in-person operations. Shortly after that, we had a series of special elections in Los Angeles County that we had to ramp up for relatively quickly. By the way, those actually ended up being, in an odd way, a blessing, because it allowed us to pilot some things that gave us some information leading into the general election, and of course, preparing for the November general election, and a whole series of additional changes that were taking place in the general election. I think the other thing that comes to my mind is layered on all that was also just a significant amount of mis and disinformation, and a dynamic we're still dealing with, still talking today, every day, about the 2020 election and the misinformation and disinformation campaign. That was already starting there. And then another impact of the pandemic, I would characterize as political anxiety. We had candidates who were rightfully so concerned about how is this going to work. Their careers, the issues that they cared about were on the line and on the ballot, and we were operating in a reactive environment while trying to implement changes that were designed to be proactive solutions. So it was a really interesting juxtaposition there, and that comes with an expected resistance to change and anxiety. And I think you see that even represented in the data. I'll end with two things on this, that on a more positive note. I think when I look back at this, I am very appreciative of the fact that the agility and the flexibility of our new voting model in California. So California, I would say, did a good job of really pushing a set of reforms and elections that allowed us to flex and prepare to address these concerns. It wasn't a roadmap by any means, but it did give us the ability to do that. And certainly the work that we had done over the prior decade on our Voting Solutions for All People project in LA County, I shudder to think of what it would have been like to go through this under our previous voting model and voting system. And then the last I would say is just the spirit of community and collaboration. And Astrid talked a little bit about that. The people in the community that opened their facilities to be vote centers in spite of the pandemic. Here in LA County, every county department of avail their employees to work at our vote centers. And we had this massive vote by mail operation that we had to put together in a matter of months. We didn't have a facility to accommodate that. Literally set that up overnight in a pavilion at the fairgrounds in LA County, and utilize that as a way to ensure that we were able to do that. So a lot of good kind of community building and collaboration stories coming out of that as well, but certainly a sense of uncertainty and anxiety.
Mindy?
Thanks. Well, first off, I just have to commend both Astrid and Dean for their leadership during that period. Dean not only putting on an election for millions of people in LA successfully, but also being a leader throughout the state and the conversation around how the state was going to get through the pandemic and still serve voters. And Astrid was a leading voice for the future of California elections. So just want to acknowledge that. And I was also part of that working group, that task force that Secretary Padilla established on the fly that did draw in really all the leading folks in the state. I was more of a fly on the wall in terms of participation. But what I heard was exactly what Astrid just mentioned, a deep commitment. Everyone came together, hours and hours on Zoom calls when they had so many more other things to be doing with their own organizations or even personally. And everyone was trying to figure out how to not only get through the next few months, but it became really clear, even though it wasn't necessarily in the public domain yet, but it became clear that we were looking at a threatened November election, or even in March and April and so forth. Excuse me. And so what I heard was election officials, many wondering, and not present company, but many wondering if they could provide any in-person locations at all. Just absolutely desperate, right, to be able to serve their voters. And so from those early days of wondering if we could even do that to what we ended up putting on in the state was actually quite amazing. And as a researcher, I'm not on the ground executing elections, but I of course was trying to pivot myself, like many other researchers. Like, how could we approach our work to make sure that we're addressing in real time the questions that were really relevant, right? That would be useful to the whole set of decisions that everybody was making. And actually, one project we did was in partnership with Astrid and the Future of California Elections, putting out a survey, trying to understand what messaging would work during that time for groups to help kind of fill in that gap, right? And maybe even counter some misinformation. And also just acknowledge the work today that Eric has led through PPIC. This report was also part of our conversations, right? Researchers getting together, Eric and I getting together, right, to talk about what was going to be absolutely critical kind of coming out of this election for us, for policymakers, for elected officials, for community groups, advocates to understand and to hopefully really encourage future conversations that are data driven, right? Because we knew all the policy changes that were happening during the pandemic period. There would be decisions made afterwards. Do we continue these? What were the impacts and so forth? And data and research was going to be a critical component of all of those kind of future evaluations. So that's where I was at least as a researcher.
We'll be getting to that, hopefully, sort of where things go next kind of question in a minute. But I think the next one I'd like to toss to Astrid and to Dean is sort of, since Mindy is an co-author on the report, I don't think she was surprised by any of the findings, but what findings about the report surprised you, and what kind of reactions did you have? Maybe I'll start with Dean for that one.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. It's interesting. I thought about this question, and I think I have to say that I think for me it's less of a surprise and more of a validation and confirmation, but also kind of a retrospective on kind of looking back at the reforms and how we implemented them, and really appreciate being able to look at the data and kind of see what it shows and how it's being interpreted. I think that it definitely demonstrates the velocity of change that took place across the cycle. And I think we could all anticipate that with that level of change that you're not going to necessarily see all of the results that you want as a result of that. But I was encouraged by the overall impact of higher participation across all sectors that was represented in the material. And I think it also sort of validates something that I think many of us have known for a long time, that the initial impact of expanded vote by mail is increased participation amongst the population that are already participating in elections, right? So I think in some ways we sometimes get trapped into thinking that that in isolation, the change to the voting model or the change to the methods of voting is going to shrink that gap. It certainly should, and we should strive to have it play that role to decrease that gap and inequity. But I think it's not surprising that that the more accessible you make elections, the more turnout you get from those who are already participating in elections, and it doesn't on its own address what may be preventing other underrepresented populations from participating. So I think that's something for us to wrestle with going forward. I do think I'm a little bit surprised, and I want to be careful how I say this, but that the kind of the interpretation of the impact on in-person voting options is an interesting one, because I think that was implemented in so many different ways throughout the state. So it's hard to look at that again in isolation as a single method. I would push back a little bit that I don't think it was a limitation on in-person voting options. In fact, I think for the individual voter, it was a broad expansion of in-person voting options. I think the question is, did people know that, and did they understand that, and were they able to take advantage of that? And I think that's where the gap still exists, right? That voting just fundamentally is recognized as something that we do on a Tuesday between certain hours at a single location that we've been assigned to. We've broken out of that mold. I think that's a good thing. I think the data even shows that in some incremental respects, and hopefully over time we'll be able to build on that. So I guess probably what stands out most to me, again, not necessarily surprised, but is that California, because of the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, with the way that the Voters' Choice Act was written, left a lot of anonymity to individual counties on how they were going to implement that, or if they were going to implement that. And so, there was a broad range of implementation models used. So it's hard to layer that over the data. And I think that's something that we'll want to look at going forward.
Astrid?
Thanks for the question. And I'll start off with a point that Dean just made regarding the in-person consolidation. And thanks for raising that, Dean. I think that's kind of something that I noticed in the report as well. Because when we were talking about the policies during the pandemic, there was a conversation about, do we have in-person locations? Is it safe for people to vote in person? And so the way the policies were crafted was to give counties options, depending on their electorate, but also election officials themselves were very limited in terms of where they could find locations to vote that provided social distancing of 6 feet, right? If you all have been to in-person voting locations in your neighbor's garage, those were suddenly not available anymore for counties. And so where people voted was very different than perhaps would have occurred in a non-pandemic space. Although, Dean, if we can have Dodger Stadium again, I would love that for LA. That was pretty cool. And so I think that's something to look at, that the in-person places were so varied across the state that people had to get used to that difference. And with practice and time, as with all reforms, once voters are aware of the changes, then there is greater use. But I appreciate that there's a focus on continuing to study that to make sure that there's a balance for how consolidation occurs. The other point of the report that I truly appreciated was that the report does a really nice job of carving out the differences of how in-person voters versus traditionally vote by mail voters will experience universal mail ballot elections, because their experience will be drastically changed. And I think that's an important thing to note, that just because you're sending every voter a ballot, there still needs to be a strong emphasis on voter education and outreach for that practice. And coupled with that was, of course, the waiving of postage, which is a really big deal, you know, and a really important point that can't be ignored for all mail ballot elections. Finding a stamp is a challenge. I know that not everybody believes that, but if you ask, you know, our youngest voters, they will look at you with the biggest confusion as to like, where do we get a stamp? I mean, and also be included, you know, going to the post office. That's another task to add to my list of things to do. So postage paid was incredibly important. Extending the deadline for ballots that were mailed on time but counted if they were received later because of delay in the postal service, that was incredibly important as well in terms of the success of being able to count those ballots. So we have to remember that there were policies around this, right? It wasn't just universal vote by mail. There were policies that were complementing that step. And then the other piece that I think is really important to think about is that, you know, the in-person voting experience, they're the ones that are gonna have to realize that there's something new. And I'll just share a quick story, you know, in the pre-pandemic world, when we all thought the Voters' Choice Act was gonna roll out smoothly. I remember traveling to San Mateo County after the first Voters' Choice Act election there, and I got to talk to Spanish-speaking voters about their experience. And some voters shared that, yes, they had received the ballot in the mail, but they thought it was a practice ballot. They did not realize it was a live ballot because they had not made that request for that ballot. They didn't know that the laws were changing. And so there was just a lot of confusion that this piece of mail that they had received was their official ballot. And so that was something new for them and something that with time they were learning, and they said that they were going to be more prepared to look out for their ballot for the November election. And so again, it's a process, right? Just because the policy is passed doesn't mean that the intended impact is going to occur right away. And that's why I think reports like this one are so valuable to just showing that things are ticking in the right way, and where do we need to recalibrate, where do we need to refocus, where do we need to pivot. So I appreciate this report so much. I think it gives us some great insights as to where we could start from here.
Awesome, thank you both. And I will second that comment about the young people and mailing things. Like my teenage kids don't even really know where the return address goes, where the stamp goes, nothing, right? So it's all Greek to them. Let me then shift to for our final set of questions here before we open it up to questions from sort of a Q&A period. Let me ask each of you about sort of moving forward. And maybe to keep it mixed up, I'll start with Mindy for this. What are your sort of most important takeaways from the report? Like, what do you think we need to think about most when, you know, God willing, the pandemic comes to an end? Sort of what should be our the next steps in our planning as a state for election administration?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I mean, certainly I think just that emphasis that these findings are about informing future elections, right, and future work in the state. We understand, it's been noted already many times today, that the pandemic not only was a unique set of circumstances, but it was everyone working at their absolute best, right, with the best intentions under extraordinary circumstances. And so the reality, though, is that there are policy discussions ongoing now and certainly in the future about what to take, right, what to learn from when it comes to the results of how well elections were run during the pandemic period. And so I just want to emphasize first that it's for future elections. But you mentioned earlier, Eric, that there's a lot of ongoing conversation around the fact now that we have it written in our law that we're automatically mailing everybody a vote by mail ballot. And some of those conversations are really kind of dominating policymaker perspectives, I think. And we need to make sure that we are, and our policymakers are having conversations that are data driven, and we hope this research informs that. So it isn't about, as you've already stated, that we should be critical of in-person options, but rather it's about improving, right? What we do offer, understanding the nuance in the types of models, and hopefully everyone has the goal of really being, critical is not quite the right word, but to really have a realistic assessment of how these policies are impacting the equity question. And the difference matters, right? The nuance in the research matters. The outreach is absolutely, I think the findings show that the outreach, that the quality of the outreach, how extensive the outreach is done in counties across the state is absolutely enormously important. And we know that outreach efforts are chronically underfunded. And we know from other work that voters don't know about all of their changes, right? In terms of how and when they can cast their ballot. This is ongoing. It's going to be likely ongoing for many elections. Yes, people over time, Astrid, you're right, of course, that they start to learn and adjust. But there are consequences, right, to those that we know that that's not at the same rate for every group. And that can impact people's voting rates and their experience, actually participating in the election. So just want to emphasize not only the importance of outreach, but tailored outreach that meets voters where they're at, that is based on data, based on the understanding of the differences in terms of the impact of voters. It just is absolutely really critically important. And under the VCA, the consolidation aspect of the VCA, certainly I think there's things that we can learn there from this research in terms of making sure that that is executed in a way that is better reaching more historically underrepresented voters.
Let me turn to Astrid next. So what are your sort of post-pandemic priorities as both an advocate and as someone who has facilitated connections between election administrators and advocates?
Yeah, I think that we have to remember that it isn't really post-pandemic, right? It's we're being told that a best case scenario, we're going to be living with an endemic disease. And so we continue to have to be flexible to respond to infection rates, to social distancing, and remembering that some of us may never go back to a quote normal world, that we're completely impacted by this pandemic. So as someone who, really values learning from others, I think it's important to remember to bring others into these conversations to make sure that we always are including diverse voices, diverse perspectives when planning for elections. That election officials consult with, not just community organizations, but also with voters in their communities that can share their lived experiences. That community advocates connect with election officials to learn about the changes. And for me, what is incredibly important about our continued election system is not just looking at improving outreach, but improving quality education for voters. Election officials spend so much of their funding on, creating materials that are translated. So let's make sure that those materials are quality translations. Let's make sure that the messages are in plain language. Let's make sure that the messages that are communicated are culturally relevant and sensitive. And so all of that can only happen if we continue elevating collaboration across sectors, continue partnering. I thought the business sector did a great job in also stepping in to support voters by providing some venues to vote in for the pandemic. And I hope that those partnerships continue into the future. I think it's also important when you're looking at policies to recall that it's not a one size fits all ever, but especially in a state as diverse as California. And so recognizing that voters may need to update their voter registration with language preferences, especially in advance of sending a ballot in the mail. Let's make sure that it's being sent in the language that that voter needs, and to increase those opportunities for voters to select their voting preferences in advance. So I have to continue being an advocate for increased cross-sector collaboration. I think we can all be better when we learn from each other. And then I also have to lift up the human-centered design approach that Dean's VSAT project has brought into the election space. Yes, it takes time. Yes, it's more complicated, but we can't design a system, an election system that is disconnected to the intended audience. We need to make sure that election administration is happening in partnership with voters and making a special effort to reach traditionally underrepresented voters if we really want to address that turnout gap.
And finally, Dean, looking at it from the perspective of an election administrator, sort of what do you see as your priorities moving forward, either on the topics of this report or kind of more generally for California?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is and I hope that this is a shared value, is that we need to see this as not as a go back moment, but a go forward moment, and that we need to leverage the success of I mean, we really had remarkable success in California, despite all the obstacles that we talked about here. And we need to figure out how to leverage those successes and to stabilize. And some of those things are basic things. Like there was a lot of resources pumped into the success of the election in 2020. For the first time, the state, through the state budget, actually put money towards supporting the local election infrastructure, and the outreach and education that we've all talked about here. Some of that funding went towards that. So we need to make that a normal part of the budget process, so that those funds remain available. Some of the community collaboration that we did, Astrid joked about having Dodger Stadium as a vote center. We really benefited from having high profile, high visible locations open their doors for us for in-person voting. And we need to cultivate that and make sure that voters going forward are familiar with those in-person voting options, and that we keep them in familiar, visible locations. There's a couple of areas I think that we need to, I love that you focused a little bit on the complexity of primaries, and I would take that a step further and say, particularly in California, the presidential primary, most complicated election that we run in California, because it's designed for the political party nomination process. It's not designed for voters. And now that we're mailing every voter a vote by mail ballot, before we get to that March 2024 election, we need to have a serious conversation in California about how are we going to determine which ballot the voters who don't have a political party preference are going to get in the mail, because otherwise it's going to be chaotic and people are going to be frustrated. And so I guess that's what I mean when I say it's a go forward moment, is we should be looking at those kind of things. We should be looking at the fact that in a vote by mail environment, we rely so heavily on the validation of the voter's signature that if we're not careful, that can become a form of administrative disenfranchisement. So what are we doing to ensure that we have good quality signatures from voters, or are there alternative methods of validation that we can layer onto the signature verification? So building on those successes, maintaining our stakeholder partnerships. I think your studies on underrepresented populations really speak to the need to engage with the stakeholder community, with our language advocacy communities, our voting accessibility advocacy communities. We're still new in California to the impact of Prop 17. So individuals who have been involved with our criminal justice system, who in fact have the right to vote and to participate, we should be doing outreach to those folks as well, and letting them know both about their eligibility, but also about their options. And finally, just to really underscore what I think everybody has said here, that universal vote by mail is a ballot distribution method. That doesn't mean that we should underemphasize in-person voting options. I mean, the beauty of some of the policy that's passed in California, the conditional voter registration law, the ability to use ballot drop boxes, those are all important things. So having those in-person options is an important element to ensuring that we shrink those participation gaps going forward.
Excellent. So now I'd like to turn to Q&A, and I just want to remind viewers that if you have a question, well, our team is so great, they're on top of it. Please send to the email address on the screen here, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. So ppiceventquestions@gmail.com if you have a question you'd like to direct to anybody on the panel. But we already have a few here in the chat, and this first one actually is addressed to Mindy. And the question is, what parallels do you see in this new research and your recently published report on Black voter experiences in California?
Thanks for the question. There are parallels. I mean, certainly in this research today, the emphasis on the impact on Black voters and other voters of color from changing in-person voting locations. In the report that we released, Meyer Center released on Monday on the Black voter experience, we know that Black voters of when we compare them to when we compare them to voters of other racial and ethnic groups, had the largest proportion of survey respondents that didn't know about the changes to the election, about how and when they could vote, for instance. There was a lot of outreach, certainly we can understand from that research report, that's needed for Black voters. And in the focus group conversations we had out of that report, we heard firsthand from Black voters talking about concerns around changes to their polling place, trust in getting their ballots to the places where they should be to be counted. We conclude in the report that from a lot of voters that we spoke with, there was a recognition and an appreciation for all of the options that California does provide. So even for voters that were concerned about whether their ballot was actually going to be counted, they still recognized and all of the options, even if they weren't aware of each and every one of them that was available to them. The fact that there were options available was something that they valued and felt like it was almost a trust factor, right, with election officials, that in a state like California, election officials, policymakers, they're trying to make sure that our vote gets counted in some way compared to what people were hearing in other states. So what we learned from that research, one of the things that we learned from that research was just kind of, again, the nuance around how people think about options, how they hear about options, and the trust factor and the importance of information, because generally voters are low information, and the need, again, to getting those kind of targeted messages that might help improve, right, data that we see when we're looking at impacts from consolidation, potentially.
The next question, which I think Dean kind of started to get out a little bit, which is what advice you have to increase turnout in primary elections. And I'll just say, I'll use the chair's prerogative and be the first to respond here and say, like, I think one of the key things about our report is that whatever you do when you're looking specifically at the equity question, the main challenge of the primary election has to do with kind of who's on the cusp of participation, and so you actually may have to sort of over target any efforts that you make in a primary election to try and really ensure that underrepresented groups participate are bumped up to the same degree as overrepresented groups, just because of the natural dynamics of those primary elections. And I also would think that as complicated as it is with the presidential primaries, I think the splitting of the times that we have split the presidential and the state legislative primary away from each other is always going to hurt turnout for that second one, right? So it's consolidating them is even as complicated as it is going to raise that primary participation for all those other decisions. But I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in on this question of turnout in primaries, and if you had any reactions or thoughts that you wanted to add.
I would just add, Eric, a quick observation that I'm noticing about the upcoming primary. So we're less than 100 days away from the gubernatorial primary, and again making that distinction, because how we run gubernatorial year primaries and how we run presidential primaries are fundamentally different. But here in LA, and maybe this isn't true across the state, but here in LA, this will be the first primary election where the consolidation of local offices onto the even year election cycle will really have significance. So we have the City of LA election with an open mayoral race on the ballot at the same time as all of our state congressional officers and state legislators in their new redistricted districts. And I think it's going to be interesting to see the impact that has on turnout. Maybe it's an anomaly, but what I'm seeing so far, when we're still a week away from the final nomination period. But I'm actually seeing here that those local races are dominating the more competitive contests on this ballot. So is that going to drive a more localized push for turnout because of the mayoral races or an open supervisorial district race here in the county, which is somewhat unique in recent history? A very crowded race for county sheriff and a lot of dialogue around that. So it's driving a different type of dialogue than we've seen in previous primaries. So I'll be very curious to see if that has an impact on the turnout going forward.
Just out of curiosity, is
Yeah,
it still an inverted ballot with the local races on the top?
In Los Angeles County, it is. So we are on a 2-year pilot where the local offices start at the top of the ballot. Little bit. I don't want to get too far down in the weeds. A little bit tweaked this year because we also have that odd situation with the U.S. Senate contest appearing twice on the ballot. So that changes the order a little bit. But yes, the local races are focused on the top of our ballot with the state and federal races at the end of the ballot.
Sorry, go ahead.
Eric and Mindy, I said, Eric and Mindy, I'm hearing another research project right there. But I just one thing I'll add, just to build on this conversation about how to increase turnout for the primary. I mean, let's fund elections for outreach and education to do it right, and not just during election season, but do it year round. You know, just like we have spring cleaning every year, let's have a season where we continue to be mindful of preparing for our civic duties to vote. But also recognizing that it's a learning process for a lot of voters. You know, we have many naturalized voters and a large immigrant population that are experiencing our democracy for the first time. And the education needs to consider all of that to make sure that, you know, what's happening in the street is connected to that vote. And we need to continue educating new voters each year on that process. And also recognizing that every year we will have new voters, right? So even though last cycle people were familiar with the Voters' Choice Act, well, there's a whole new group of voters that, you know, are going to be entering the space. So voter education needs to continue every year to be mindful of every new group that is entering to make sure that we are fully engaging. But let's truly be mindful about how we're funding education and outreach as part of our improving turnout and addressing the equity issue.
Maybe one just very sort of general question that to wrap things up, which is, are there any, so let's put aside the sort of pandemic related issues. Is there anything else out there in the landscape in California elections that we should be thinking about, worrying about, focusing on, anything that maybe, you know, is not getting the attention it deserves? I know that's very general, but just if there's anything along those lines people want to.
Yeah, I'll jump in and just say that and I mentioned this earlier, and our board of supervisors here in LA County just passed a motion earlier this week. The dynamic of misinformation and disinformation is significant, and the fact that we are still talking about the legitimacy of the 2020 presidential election well over a year afterwards is a factor in the confidence of our voters and the confidence of our electorate, and will, I think, affect turnout. So I think things like focusing on identifying election officials, the Secretary of State and local registrars as the trusted source of information, not about the politics of the election, but about the mechanics of the election. Because I think part of what we're dealing with is, you know, we're all subject to the national media. So some of the concerns that we heard about participation in the 2020 election were based on media reports that were happening in the swing states and the presidential contest that really didn't apply here, but I would argue they had an effect on turnout of those underrepresented populations. And I think that's represented, Mindy, in the study, the study that you talked about with Black voters and the concerns that they have, because that was a factor in several of the swing states and the policies that are being passed. So I think, you know, really being cognizant about overrepresenting education about the mechanics of voting and how things work here in the state of California is going to become more and more critical going forward.
I'll just add, not a policy specifically, but a practice that we've seen really elevates the way elections are conducted is continuing to consult each other to promote cross-sector collaboration as we build policies of the future. I think it's something that at Future of California Elections, we, have been working on for a decade. This model was elevated during the pandemic. And so let's learn from that, and let's make sure that we continue opening our doors and seeing who's at the table, but more importantly, who's not at the table when we're making policy decisions and having policy discussions.
I will echo everything that Dean and Astrid just mentioned, and I guess also just to emphasize again, trusted messengers, the trust component of how elections are conducted, but also why it's important to vote, why people's vote matters. Again, meeting voters where they're at and the differences across groups by age, race, ethnicity, all sorts of statuses. And then lastly, just want to highlight that what we're doing in California is also a model for the rest of the country, right? Not every other state sees us that way, but what we do, how we run our elections, the impact of our elections on our voters has, has consequences potentially for other states, as other states look to us for research, for outcomes, just recognizing that we're not in an isolation bubble in that sense, and that we have, for good or bad, we have impact in other states as well in terms of what we're doing.
Fantastic. Well, we've reached the end of our time. I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today. It's terrific to have you here for this conversation. You are the very best of the California elections community, which is already a great community. Thanks again to our funders, and thanks to all of you, the audience, for joining us today online. If you pre-registered for this event, later today you'll receive a survey. We'd appreciate if you could take a couple of minutes to respond and just let us know how we did, good or bad. Thanks again. Please be safe and have a good afternoon.